It is with respect to climate change and biodiversity loss that we are here today. The most recent assessment by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has found that between 2021 and 2040, there is more than a 50% chance that global temperature will reach or surpass the 1.5 degrees Celsius target established under the auspices of the Paris Agreement. Changing course to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius will require deep and sustained reductions in emissions of greenhouse gas emissions in the near term. Moreover, according to the IPCC, existing climate change impacts on ecosystems are more widespread and severe than expected, and as warming levels increase, so do the risks of species extinction and irreversible loss of biodiversity. The international community stands at an inflection point. Climate change and biodiversity loss are inextricably connected and together pose an unprecedented threat to our ecosystems, our livelihoods, and the sustainability of the planet. What we do or do not do about this threat today will have permanent and immeasurable consequences for our collective future. Climate change and biodiversity loss are existential issues that transcend borders and compel us to confront the relationship between our modern economies and their impact on nature. They therefore require collective action and collaboration among nations to develop shared ambitions, frameworks, and policies to guide our actions. Both law and diplomacy play a critical role in shaping such collective action and collaboration. International law establishes common obligations and reflects the shared commitment of states to tackle these global environmental challenges. However, agreement between states, with often divergent national interests, on the substantive content of the law, as well as its implementation, would not occur without diplomacy. Diplomacy is an intangible and multifaceted craft, but at the minimum requires deep understanding of countries' positions and interests, a recognition that compromise is essential, and the ability to persuade governments that in certain circumstances, the interests of the international community outweigh the interests of individual states. It is against this context that APCEL is privileged to bring together distinguished experts to share their insights on the role of law and diplomacy in shaping solutions to these pressing challenges. Our speakers today have had extensive and fascinating careers in both law and diplomacy. Equally as important is the fact that both have also been champions of the environment. It gives me great pleasure to introduce them. Forgive me, Professor Koh, this is going to be a bit long. Professor Tommy Koh is currently Emeritus Professor of Law at NUS, Ambassador at Large.
I think you can skip my introduction.
No.
Yeah, everybody knows me. Praise Laura, please praise Laura.
Well, okay, but maybe then I can highlight very key aspects of your biography. He is, on a personal note, right, he is also the chairman of the International Advisory Panel of the Center for International Law, as well as one of the driving forces behind the establishment of APCEL and co-chair of the advisory committee for APCEL. Prof. Koh is an experienced international lawyer and diplomat. He was the president of the Third UN Conference of the Law of the Sea, leading to the adoption of the 1982 UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. He was also chairman of the preparatory committee and the main committee of the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio, which led to the adoption of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the Rio Declarations of Principle on Environment and Development, which has had an outsized influence on international environmental law. Well, I'm not listening to him, obviously. Among his many honors and accolades, he's received Champion of the Earth Award from UNEP, as well as the inaugural President's Award for the Environment from Singapore. Okay, I'm done now. For Prof. Koh. Ms. Laura Clarke OBE has also had a long and diverse career in diplomacy. She is currently the Chief Executive Officer of the global environmental law organization ClientEarth, whose mission is to use law to address the world's most pressing environmental challenges. ClientEarth's innovative work has been globally recognized, leading it to be regularly featured in the Financial Times Innovative Lawyers rankings in Europe, and the recipient of numerous awards, including from the British Legal Awards, the Lawyer, and Legal 500. Laura herself has worked extensively on climate, environmental, and sustainability issues in her career, having previously served as the British High Commissioner to New Zealand and with diplomatic roles across Africa, Asia, and Europe for over 20 years. Laura was also the governor of the Pitcairn Islands, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, exercising oversight of the governance and sustainability of the islands, and was responsible for maximizing the benefits of the marine protected area, the fourth largest in the world. I hear Prof. Koh saying it's Pitcairn Islands, my apologies. The conversation today will be moderated by my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Jolene Lin, who is Director of APCEL and Associate Professor at the Faculty of Law at NUS. Jolene herself is a renowned expert on climate change and has most recently focused her work in drawing global attention to climate change law policy in the Global South and the role of cities in tackling climate change. Her research has been published all over the place, and particularly in leading international law journals. And she is also on several editorial boards, as well as the board for the Foundation for International Law for the Environment. And as January this year, she's been part of NUS Law's leadership team. Okay, that's it with the introductions. Given their extensive knowledge and experience, which I feel I have barely done justice to, I'm confident that we will have a robust and lively dialogue between experts who have had years of experience working with countries around the world and in international fora to combat environmental degradation. And without further ado, I am pleased to hand the floor over to Jolene.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this dialogue with Professor Tommy Koh and Laura Clarke. As is always the case, I sent my questions to Professor Koh for vetting about 1 week ago. He said they looked good, they were fine, or at least he had nothing to say about them. But today he told me we would do something different. And as is always the case, Professor Koh always gives me homework to do just before, and so I seek your understanding, but I will do my best as always. So as Tara has shared, today we have two very distinguished career diplomats here. Both Professor Koh and Laura share a common past in having been outstanding career diplomats. And both of them have dedicated a large part of their working lives to protecting our planet. So this dialogue, I think, is a rare opportunity to hear from these two highly esteemed career diplomats on the critical issues that we face today on climate change and biodiversity loss. I would like to open by with some background on these issues, and more broadly on the state of the health of our planet. And perhaps I'll first turn to Laura. I'd like to ask you your views on where we stand today, and perhaps you could also share with us about what ClientEarth does in this space. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And it's such a pleasure to be here in beautiful Singapore. And I'd like to acknowledge Professor Koh, Jolene, Tara, and everyone, all distinguished guests in the audience. And I feel very humbled to be on a panel with Professor Koh, because I think I'm in the foothills of career-wise achieving what he has achieved throughout his career. So, you know, why are we all here? Why are we all focused on these issues? You know, we're here because we're worried. We're worried about the state of climate change, rapid climate change with emissions still rising. We're worried about the crisis in biodiversity, with 69% of biodiversity having been lost in the last 50 years. We're worried about the state at which, the pace at which we are polluting our seas, our air, our water. On the current trajectory, the ocean will hold more plastic than fish by 2050. And we worry about what sort of world we're leaving our children and our children's children. And, you know, and I think sometimes when you look at the scale of the challenge and you read the news, you read the papers, and you look at the sheer inertia of the vested interests that you have in this society, the question then is, well, how do we best effect change? And I tend to think that these problems are so all-encompassing. It's sort of great big ball of a problem that are these polycrises, and we have to come at them from multiple different angles, from government, from business, from civil society. society, from diplomacy, from law, and from behavioral science, from technology. You know, we need to come at them from multiple angles. But I do think that law and diplomacy are very, very powerful tools and can be used very effectively together. And what we do at ClientEarth is we essentially see the value of the law in really finding those leverage points to change the systems that we have created in terms of how people interact with the world. So how do we get our energy? How do we grow and transport our food? How do we use the oceans? You know, how do we use the law essentially to get to a point where people live in better balance with the planet? That's our mission and that's our vision. And we use at ClientEarth, we use the law in different ways. We work across the entire life cycle of the law, right from, you know, looking at the science and saying, well, what does that mean in terms of what we need for policy and legislation, through to advising on getting the right legislation in place, through to making sure it's implemented properly, that it's enforced properly. And we use the law and work in different ways and in different geographies around the world. So we're 300 strong, increasingly global. We grew up in the UK and Europe, if you like, but increasingly global. And we use the law in different ways. So we sometimes in some places advocate for the right sort of legislation, even supporting governments in drafting legislation. We do training and build capacities. We train prosecutors and judges. We work with lawyers. We work with community groups, say in West Africa, to give them the tools they need to engage on forest governance reform. And in some parts of the world, mostly Europe, we use litigation to hold governments to account for their climate commitments, and corporates to account. But we work in different ways in different places. And in Asia, our focus is very much not on litigation. It's worth saying that really clearly. In Asia, our focus is on working collaboratively with governments, with regulators, with civil society, and with the private sector to do all we can to support the ambition to move to a greener economy and to protect our natural ecosystems. So that's my opening spiel. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. I have been told that Professor Koh has a question.
Thank you, Jolene. First, I want all of you to look at the wall. Temasek Shophouse is dedicated to connecting people, uplifting communities, protecting the planet, and advancing capability. It is so appropriate to our discussion this morning. The question I want to ask Laura is this. ClientEarth has a reputation of being very litigious. You have brought lawsuits against the director of Shell. You brought a lawsuit against Cargill. This approach of using law both as a weapon as well as a shield, which I understand, you know, and as a lawyer, I acknowledge is sometimes the right approach. But such an approach doesn't go down well culturally in many Asian countries, you know. You operate in China, and I'd like to know, what do you do in China? And are you successful in China?
Thank you. Yes. Is this still working? Yeah. And you're absolutely right. And what I would say, Professor Koh, is we are focused on working in ways that can deliver the maximum impact for the benefit of the planet. And we are, I think it's, you know, worth restating and being really clear that we don't see litigation as the right approach and tool in this part of the world, because it's really important that we work in a way that best suits the local geography, cultural and political context. And so, for example, in China, you asked about our work there, which is led by Dimitri, who's here in the audience. Our work in China, we're there at the invitation of the Supreme Court, and what we're doing there is training prosecutors, training judges, so that they are able to better ensure that environmental laws and regulations are enforced. We also engage with the Ministry for Ecology and Environment on key issues like greening the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, so providing policy advice. And broadly in Asia, in Southeast Asia and wider Asia, we're focused on supporting the corporate sector in terms of the finance transition. We're focused on this sort of training element, and also focus on really enhancing international cooperation and learning from each other on how we accelerate the transition.
Thank you. I think the approach you have taken in China will go down very well in ASEAN. I think advancing capabilities in order to protect the planet is the right way to go. It doesn't mean that you should hesitate to blow the whistle if you think that we are going down the wrong path. But it's best left to the locals to do that. The battle must be fought and won by us who live here.
Thank you, Prof. Koh. Prof. Koh, I have a more general question for you. Multilateral environmental agreements, which we all know you have deep experience of, are usually brought to the ground in the form of domestic legislation and policies. So you've spoken a bit about the role of litigation. How best can we use the law to protect our lands and oceans?
It's one thing to adopt international agreements at the global level. It's another thing to bring it down to the regional level and then to bring it down to the local level. So let's take some example. Under the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, there's a regular meeting of Conference of Parties. And I remember that some years ago, the question was raised, do the cities have a role in conserving biodiversity? I think the narrative at the time was that cities are the enemies of biodiversity. But being one of the few city-states in the world, we wanted to counter that narrative and said, it's wrong to view cities as enemies of biodiversity because we are living more and more in an urban world. So why don't we enlist cities as champions of biodiversity? And I must say that my colleagues in National Parks Board did a lot of homework, and they managed to persuade many like-minded countries and cities to support us and to adopt an index of biodiversity for cities. And the UN were very kind to Singapore and called it the Singapore Index. So that's an example of bringing it down to the ground. We are all parties to CITES, which is an international treaty forbidding trade in flora and fauna which are endangered. So we are a party to CITES. We try to enforce that law through domestic legislation. It's not always easy, especially when you are a very big international port like Singapore. But we do our best. The important thing is that the local authority must have ownership of the law. If the local authority doesn't have ownership of the law, then enforcement will be feeble. But if the local authority has ownership of the law, then enforcement will be good. So, but it's also important to operate at the regional level. So I think as a member of ASEAN, we try very hard to bring this international agreement down to the ASEAN level. And Professor Koh Keng Lian, who's here, is a champion of ASEAN environmental law. Over the years, ASEAN has enacted a significant corpus of laws and agreements protecting the environment. Yeah.
Thank you, Prof. Koh. So, Laura, I would like to come back to ClientEarth's work in Asia. ClientEarth uses the law to protect people and planet, and you've spoken a little bit about that. Could you tell us a little bit more about ClientEarth's work here in Asia?
Thank you. So, my brain works best in threes. So if it's okay, I'll give sort of three broad buckets of work that we do and we're focused on in Asia, and all based essentially on the sense that climate change is happening apace. and biodiversity loss is happening apace in this region. And that's clear to everyone. And time and again, we see governments that acknowledge that, recognize it, are setting out a plan, putting in place the right policy frameworks, the right legislative frameworks. And so our focus as ClientEarth is really, how do we bring our experience and expertise, and the fact that we have lawyers from multiple different jurisdictions with real expertise in climate and environmental issues, how do we best share that expertise in this ecosystem, essentially, that's being built to make the transition to a better, more sustainable world? And the areas that we are focused on are three broad buckets, as I call them. One, around finance, second, training, and thirdly, international cooperation. So I'll just talk a little bit about each of them. On finance, we are very much engaged as a legal partner in the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, the Asia Pacific chapter, and we're very much supporting on the managed phase out of coal initiative. I think that's critically important. We also play a role in convening thinking and best practice on green finance. So we're hosting in July in Oxford a group of sustainable finance leaders, because it's so important, I think, that you have networks of people who are incredibly expert in this to drive the issues forward. We also provide quite a lot of analysis and guidance for the private sector. What does a really good net zero transition plan look like? It's one thing to make the commitment. It's another thing to have a plan that genuinely is Paris aligned and really does what it needs to do to get to net zero. And we also provide guidance and advice for investors, for example, for looking at, well, what is a really good investment in this regard, what to look out for in terms of greenwashing. And just another example, that we're just getting started with a presence in Japan, which is very exciting. And just recently, we along with the UK Transition Plan Task Force and the University of Oxford, did an event on what does a good transition plan look like. So I think that's really important, really supporting corporates who are wanting to do the right thing in doing that successfully. The second area, I've talked a bit about the training work that we do in China. We've also recently started a new arrangement with Indonesia, with the Judicial Training Center of the Indonesian Supreme Court, to provide similar training. And we work with law clinics across the Philippines in supporting efforts to train lawyers in climate and environmental legal issues. And then on what I sort of call the international cooperation side, we work to support governments and regulators to get the right policies, the right legislation in place. And so, for example, we worked, a lot of talk about the importance of ASEAN as a regional forum. That's hugely important. We work to support the ASEAN working group with the guidelines on social and effective social forestry, the guiding principles for that, critically important in terms of forest governance. We've also worked supporting the Philippine government on regulation for the energy transition, and through our role as an implementing partner on the EU-China Environment Project, we've played quite an important behind-the-scenes role in supporting preparations in the run-up to the Convention Biodiversity meeting in Montreal last year, in the Kunming-Montreal framework. And I think what's interesting in a way is we talk about the role of diplomacy and we talk about the role of the law, but actually there's a sort of quite a gray space in between where actually law is diplomacy as well. And I think a lot of what is done at international legal negotiations, of course, it's the hard legal negotiation, but there's a lot of diplomacy underway there, and that's a big focus for ClientEarth too.
Rob, would you like to
Very impressive. No, I'm very impressed.
You're very charming.
Yeah. Very impressed.
Sorry, Prof. I was going to ask you, would you like to ask a question? Would you like me? Okay, I'll go ahead. Okay, Prof. So one of the questions I wanted to ask you kind of follows up from a webinar I watched last year that you gave on the 30 years assessment of the Rio Summit, right? In 1992, 179 countries gathered in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, for the historic UN Conference on the Environment and Development, also known as the Earth Summit. And you were the chair of the Earth Summit's preparatory committee. This summit was supposed to usher in a new era, right? A new international framework for climate change, biodiversity protection, and sustainable development. In 1992, as is the case today, there are differences between the developing countries and the developed countries. And there is a diverse range of interests in the negotiations. Can you share with us how you sought to build consensus?
With great difficulty. But more seriously, I want to take a look back at 92 and look at what has happened in the last 30 years. Before Rio, there was a huge ideological battle between North and South. The developed countries were very keen that we should do something to protect our environment. Many colleagues in the developing world were very suspicious of the North. And some of them actually argued that there was a conspiracy by the rich countries to retard development by the South, which of course was not true, but many developing countries believed that. And the narrative that was being spread was that we should ignore the North, let's get rich first, and then we can clean up later. This was a quite popular view. Heading into Rio, I was very concerned by this polarization of views between North and South. And I think one of my most important priorities in Rio was to bring about a reconciliation. I would say post-92, there's no longer this huge divide between North and South. I think both sides agreed that yes, we want development, we want to eliminate poverty, but in the process of doing so, we don't want to ruin the environment and make it uninhabitable. So the Rio Summit offered this concept of sustainable development, which was something that both the North and South could accept. So I would say that ideological battle is over. When I look at the state of the world then and now, I must say that we haven't made a lot of progress. If you look at the biodiversity, for example, the last 30 years have been a disaster, I would say, for the biodiversity of the world. And at the recent meeting in Montreal, we adopted a very promising Kunming Montreal framework with, I think, 16 targets. Was it 16? 16 targets, which were very ambitious. The most ambitious of which was that we will all agree to devote 30% of our land, water, and oceans to protect them from development. Many skeptics told me that, so what? In all previous meetings, we adopted all kinds of targets, and we've never achieved them. So why should we think that the Kunming Montreal targets can be achieved? I really have no answer to the skeptic, except to hope that we'll reach a tipping point when the government and people of the world realize that the loss of biodiversity will impact human health and human survival. So on Earth Day this year, I wrote an article called Healthy Planet, Healthy People. And I wanted to make the argument that we should be concerned about the loss of biodiversity because it impacts our own survival and our health. So I'm hoping that things have changed and that we will take biodiversity as seriously as we take climate change. On climate change, I think we are in a very precarious position right now, Laura. I think our scientists and Singapore Chief Climate Change Negotiator, Joseph Teo, is here. I don't know where Joe is sitting. Joe keep telling me that the situation is quite desperate and that if we want to achieve the target of 1.5 degrees Celsius, we have to bring down global CO2 emission very substantially between now and 2030. And the bad news is that emission is still rising. Yeah. The good news from EU is that EU's emission has gone down. So, but unlike biodiversity, I think the world has now awakened to climate change, global warming, and sea level rise. And almost every country is taking it seriously. My government taking it very, very seriously. We have a very ambitious green plan. We have a pledge to achieve net zero by 2050. We have said we will bring down emission very significantly between now and 2030. And I'm very happy to say, Laura, that our business community are on board. This is very important. You know, so many companies have pledged to support net zero and have pledged their own plans to substantially reduce CO2 by themselves, by their supplier, by their customer by 2030. So the situation is desperate, but not hopeless.
Thank you. And I think that lots of us are looking with great optimism at Singapore, because when Singapore says it's going to do something, it generally then has the ability to set about and making that happen. So I think there's great source for optimism there, and really important that the business sector is so engaged on this, and that's important both for the health of the planet, but also from a sort of hard-nosed commercial viability perspective. And I think that's the increasing recognition, isn't it? That if you're not thinking about biodiversity implications, if you're not thinking about climate implications, you're not actually managing your company and looking after its long-term commercial viability in the best way possible. Yeah.
I'm happy to tell you, Laura, that the 3 Singapore banks have all come up with very ambitious plans. Yeah, the latest of which is OCBC. So I'm very encouraged, that I see in the private sector real commitment. And even the real estate developers have all pledged to become green companies.
I'm glad to hear that. You know, it's really quite worrying, the state of the environment, you know, when we talk about climate change, biodiversity, plastics pollution. But you're right, Prof, that, you know, hopefully we are at a tipping point, and there's this seizure of the opportunities before the window closes. And you've mentioned the importance of getting businesses on board. Laura, I wanted to ask you, in your view, the idea that, you know, we always talk about the role of diplomacy being important to get governments to take concerted action on climate change and biodiversity loss. And in your experience, what do you think is also the role of diplomacy in getting other actors, you know, apart from governments, to take action?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, you know, at its heart, diplomacy is the art of the possible. You know, it's how do you build understanding between peoples and therefore then build collaboration. And it's most commonly understood as government-to-government engagement, but of course it goes much more widely than that. It's really about hearts and minds, and how do you, you know, really build relationships across all sectors of society and the economy, and work together on a common goal. And I think that's particularly important when you're looking at the climate agenda, for example. And I was, of course, I only left the UK government last year, and I think that our work in the run-up to COP26 in terms of our climate outreach and climate diplomacy was incredibly powerful. We had ambassadors and high commissioners around the world seeing this as their top priority, supported by expert staff. And, you know, one of the things in a way that we were sort of trying to generate was what I might call virtuous competitiveness. You know, if one country comes up with its new nationally determined contribution or pledge, you know, then you might say to others, well, look, do you think you could match that, or there's something to be learned there? And I was working, of course, with New Zealand and in the South Pacific. And, you know, our work there, of course, focused on what governments were doing, but it was also about working with progressive businesses, working in New Zealand with Te Ao Māori, with Māori of New Zealand, working with the media to keep the focus on these issues. And all of that really served to create what I would like to say is a sort of enabling environment for higher ambition. Because often with governments, they're always having to think about, oh, well, perhaps there's another election around the corner. If you can create a sense of expectation amongst the public, amongst business, that this is the right thing to do, I think that's really powerful.
Thank you, Laura. Prof. Koh, I'd like to ask you the same question. What do you think is the role of diplomacy in getting governments to take concerted action on the environmental issues?
Repeat your question. What's the role of diplomacy
In getting governments
in
and
getting government?
maybe other stakeholders too, like businesses, to take action on environmental issues?
Diplomacy is the art of persuasion. And if you're a good diplomat, I think your job is to understand the different interests of various stakeholders, to think of creative ways in which you can accommodate these competing interests, and at the same time find a consensus that moves you forward. So I see that as a role of a diplomat, whether in your own country, at the region, or on the international stage. So it's both my fortune and misfortune to have been asked to chair a lot of negotiations, whether it's the Earth Summit or Law of the Sea. And in both domains, my job basically is to first win the confidence of my colleagues so they would trust me. Second, to understand well what their competing interests are. And third, to find creative ways in which I can accommodate those interests and yet come to a consensus that move things forward. I would say that that's my role.
Thank you, Prof. May I ask a follow-up question? How has your training as a lawyer helped you or not helped you as a diplomat and as a negotiator?
The three of us are, oh no, you're not a lawyer. Yeah. Laura studied economics in the London School of Economics. And then for some reason, she went to Oxford and studied Russian and German. Yeah. I don't know how studying German and Russian prepares you for your current job. Whether a lawyer makes a good diplomat is controversial. Yeah. No, I'm serious. It's controversial. I remember sitting at a meeting between my foreign minister and Henry Kissinger. And Kissinger had a very senior staffer who had been legally trained, you see. And we were discussing something quite important, whether it was possible to do it or not, whether it's consistent with international law or not. And Kissinger's staffer said, Mr. Secretary, your proposal is not consistent with international law. He didn't want to hear that, He was quite rude to his staffer, He said you should be in a church rather than in a foreign service. I thought that was such an uncalled for. So I stood up for him and said, as a lawyer, I resent that remark, and that there's a role for lawyers in a foreign service. And I tell you my baptism of fire, okay? In 1968, when I was as young as Jolene, I was 30 years old, and then because Singapore became accidentally independent and we had no foreign service, so my government persuaded me to leave the law school where I was very happy teaching to be our ambassador to the UN, And summer 1968 was a baptism of fire for an international lawyer because the Warsaw Pact countries invaded Czechoslovakia, overthrew the government, and imposed a government of Moscow's choice. And I arrived and this happened. And my Soviet colleague was telling a bag full of lies. So I told my wife, I think I'm in the wrong place, I better go back to law school. If this is how diplomats behave, in total ignorance of what the charters say, what the international laws say, then there's no place for me. But over time, I've taken a more realistic view that there's a constant battle between national interest and principle. There's a constant battle between power and law. And no matter how good a country you are, how good a government you are, there will be times when interest trumps policy, when power trumps principle. But if you're a good country and a good government, you hope that most of the time your decisions, your foreign policy is consistent with the Charter and international law. And I'm happy to tell you that in the many years I've worked for Singapore, I think there were only one or two occasions where I felt not comfortable. Most of the time, the leaders of Singapore, starting with Lee Kuan Yew, Lee Kuan Yew is usually viewed by the world as somebody who's super realistic, cynical about the world. But in private, he was a good lawyer, So in a small meeting with a few of us, he would sometimes bounce ideas off us and say, Tommy, what about we do ABC, And then we say, Prime Minister, that would not be consistent with international law. And he would drop the idea, So his reputation does not reflect the reality that even in a leader like him, who's a super realist, but he realized for a small country like Singapore, in order to exist, to prosper, we need an international system of laws and rules. And that the Charter, international law, ensure our survival. And even for a realist, these are very important.
Can I ask, Professor Koh, thinking back to you in that first role in the UN when you were 30, what advice would you now give to your younger self?
Don't be cynical and resign. Or become the opposite, which is equally bad, to feel that in diplomacy, laws don't matter, rules don't matter, that everything is dependent on one criterion, and that's state interest. There's some diplomats who hold this very cynical view of the world, that what really is important is state interest, and the rest don't matter. I think Mr. Putin subscribed to that view.
Thank you, Prof. Koh, for sharing that with us. I had the privilege of reading Prof. Koh's detailed diaries when I was a very young student, where he gave me a chance to look at his diaries of the baptism of fire in '68. I must say Prof. Koh's detailed account of his everyday was impressive. It was really also, for me, a real eye-opener into how Prof. Koh was such a keen observer of every single detail. And until now, he still impresses me with his ability to remember even the cleaners' names when he comes to visit the campus regularly. Laura, I want to ask you something else about actually your time and as governor, as governor of Pitcairn. I watched the video of your visit to Pitcairn as governor, and that was quite an amazing journey. So in 2015, the UK government agreed to establish one of the largest marine protected areas in the world around Pitcairn Island. Can you tell us more about this?
Yeah, thank you. And let me step back. Let me step back a little bit, exactly, and explain, because some people have heard about Pitcairn and lots of people have never heard of it at all. So just to sort of take a step back, the Pitcairn Islands are 4 tiny islands, only one of which is inhabited, and they're right in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. So if you draw a line from New Zealand on one side and Chile on the other, they're slap bang in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And they are, the Adamstown, Pitcairn Island itself, capital of Adamstown, is the only inhabited island. It has no more than 50 people on it. And it is 2 days by boat from any other human settlement. So it really is one of the most remote communities in the world. And it is it is the UK government's smallest British overseas territory by virtue of the fact that not that it was a part of the British Empire, but because it was settled by the Bounty mutineers. So some of you will know the story of the mutiny on the Bounty. So the Bounty that in 1790 Fletcher Christian put off Captain Bligh into a rowing boat, and then they sailed around looking for somewhere to hide. and they found pitcairn, and so the community has existed there against the odds since 1790. So it's an extraordinary story, and I've got to know everyone on the island and was responsible for all sorts of controversial measures, like I once issued a temporary ban on the import of duck eggs, which Dave was quite unhappy about. So, fascinating place, but it's also, not insignificant in the context of these conversations that we're having. And I'll highlight two things. One, the plastic crisis. So Henderson Island is one of the uninhabited islands, but it is also one of the most plastic polluted territories in the world, simply by virtue of where it sits. And the South Pacific Gyre essentially gathers up and then dumps plastic after plastic after plastic. And so a few years ago, we led an expedition to the island to clear up the plastic, to study its impact on flora and fauna, and also communicate the plight of plastic to the world. And that got coverage from everything from Fox News to the Guardian in the UK, but really showing quite how pernicious this problem is. And we are very much focused on some of the efforts now to tackle plastics, right at source. So that's one element of where small pitcairn played its role on these global issues. The other is absolutely, as you say, in the marine protected area. It developed in 2015, or designated in 2015, and it's 840,000 square kilometers. And that is, a big contribution to this goal that we need to protect 30% of our oceans by 2030. And we did an expedition last year, a marine science expedition, really studying the impact of this marine protected area on efforts to preserve the ocean life. And it really, the headline is marine protected areas work. There's flourishing ecosystems down there, and even just so the sort of, your average person like me arriving there, seeing the sharks in the sea, seeing the whales just off the coast, seeing extraordinary sea life and the health of the oceans. It really is quite something. So it was, in some ways, it was a small part of my job when I was in New Zealand as British High Commissioner, but it was one that was very interesting and very important in its own way.
On marine protected area, I want to make a reference to the recent agreement by the UN Conference on BBNJ. The agreement has not yet been adopted, but will soon be adopted. The media calls it a High Seas Treaty, but one of the important achievements of that agreement is on marine protected areas. Lino was the leader of the Singapore delegation to the conference, contributed a lot to the successful conclusion of the conference.
Absolutely, very important.
Prof. Koh, Laura, I am going to open the floor to questions and let our audience pose questions or make comments. So may I invite anyone, if you wish to speak, just raise your hand and a microphone will be brought to you. So whoever might like to. Yes, Professor, sorry, Dr. Gaiman.
Thank you.
Dr. Min was the former president of the Nature Society.
I'm not a lawyer, but I have been by proximity with Professor Koh. Those Professor Kohs, I have, I think, some smattering of understanding. But thank you. I'd like to thank those speakers and Jolene too for the very, very thought-provoking and educational, and I would say not totally pessimistic like a lot of environmental talks are. So picking up on some of the threads that you've mentioned, I like what you said about a virtuous competition. And of course, Professor Koh, you talked about the importance of regional cooperation, not just, and you shared your, how you, the serious division between the developed and developing countries, the North and South, how you, in a way, use the environment and the concept of environmental sustainability to, as it were, end the distrust and hopefully the battle. So based on that, and also the importance of marine conservation, I would like to ask both speakers, how do you think the current battle, or at least the distrust between China and the US, how we could use the concept of environmental sustainability? I mean, everyone knows that they have to cooperate, but they haven't really done so in at least I can't see it on climate change or any other aspect of the environment. Can this be used, in particular marine conservation, I would think, to bring more constructive and collaborative relations between these two countries? And how would you do it?
Actually, let me start with the bad news and then give you the good news. The bad news is that, you know, at 85, I've lived through a Cold War that lasted for over 40 years. And I had hoped that in the remaining years of my life, I would not see another Cold War. And I have a very uncomfortable feeling that we are witnessing the beginning of a new Cold War with the United States, Europe, Japan, and Australia on one side, and China and Russia on the other. The relationship between Washington and Beijing has completely broken down. They see each other as a threat to their prosperity and security. And President Trump was the guy who started a trade war against China. I was hoping President Biden would stop it, but he continued the trade war and added a technology war, an ideological war. So it's a full-scale confrontation between the two countries. So I don't have good news on US-China relations. But the good news is that this rivalry between them has not been brought into climate change or biodiversity. And I'm very pleased that John Kerry continued to be able to travel to China to meet with his counterpart. And this is very important. And I think at the recent Conference of Parties in Montreal, I think the United States and China were parties to the important outcome, the framework agreement. So in these important areas, I think that the rivalry had not been injected into the... And the good news also is that the BBNJ conference, I was very worried for Ambassador Rina Lee that the US-China dispute may make her work difficult and make it not possible to conclude the conference. But fortunately, the US-China rep was not interjected into it.
I would agree with that assessment. I think that, you know, the more these issues are front and center of countries' minds in terms of being in the national interest to address the climate crisis, being in the national interest to protect biodiversity, the more you have to hope that that sort of expert level engagement leads to the right collaboration to effect the change we need. There are no solutions to these problems without the United States. There are no solutions to these problems without China. And so the question always has to be for diplomats, for the level-headed politicians, to try and keep the politics out of it and really focus on what's in the interests of people and planet.
Thank you a lot. I'm sorry. Well, since diplomacy is the art of the possible and persuasion, do you think it is possible that the South China Sea could be an arena of collaboration and cooperation between China and US, or even the Pacific?
I don't think so. I mean, the South China Sea has no, the South China Sea has become another theater of confrontation between the United States and China. As you know, the Chinese have put out a map with 9 lines, and over time, China has enhanced its claims. It now claims not only the maritime features, but also the waters. And the Chinese claim is contested by the United States, by European Union, by Japan, by Australia, and many other countries. And in order to reject China's claim, these countries have been sending their warships into the South China Sea in the so-called freedom of navigation operations. I fear that an accident may happen between one of these warships and a Chinese warship or Chinese Coast Guard, and that if that happens, things may spiral out of control. You know, so I don't have good news for you on the South China Sea.
Well, on that sobering note, Prof. Koh, I see a hand there. Munib, would you like to?
Sure.
Yes, Munib here is on the forefront of sustainable finance in Singapore.
Thank you. Thank you, both of you. Your experience, what you shared, and insights are really, really helpful and inspiring. I'm a failed lawyer from 30 years ago, decided to do investment management and have done 20 years of that without worrying about the earth. The last 10 years have been more worried about the earth. 4 years ago, I went and did a Master's of Environmental Management at NUS, and Jolene was one of my profs there, so she has taught me a lot as well. So the one question I have, and I'd love to get advice and counsel from both of you, companies have a big role to play, and we as investors have a role in influencing them. And as an example, if you look at one Japanese company, Daikin, and I'm not giving their name for any other reason, that their carbon emissions, scope 1, 2, and 3, just one company is more than New Zealand. If you add Daikin and Hitachi together, scope 1, 2, 3 is more than Australia. So you can just tell that the kind of influence that we can have on the climate from having an impact on these companies is massive, and that's become my mission in life as an investor. What advice would you give us? Because we can go the ClientEarth way and try to be a bit more activist and taking them to the courts. That could be one way. The other way is diplomacy. I'm kind of stuck in the middle. Any advice from both of you, how to influence companies to change?
I think you should continue to do what you're doing, and I salute you for what you've done, and leave the litigation to Laura.
And I would say, because I think one of the challenges here is that this stuff isn't easy, right? Actually, in some ways, we're in the foothills of getting this right. We know where we need to get to, but there's not an easy to follow path. And so as much as we can support companies in, well, this is what a really good net zero transition plan looks like. That's hugely important. Have a look at the guidance that Sean has produced on, for investors on looking at what does greenwashing look like? How do you avoid it? What can you require as an investor? I do think that's important, and I do think it's really important that we don't make the best the enemy of the good, because lots of organizations are absolutely trying to do the right thing. No one's going to get it 100% right. And so the question is then, how do we provide that support? How do we draw on the expertise, the best practice of others? How do we, frankly, shine a light on those that are doing the right thing as the gold standard so that they can become role models for others? And that's the sort of, yes, of course, in Europe, we sort of, we take companies to task if they say they're doing the right thing and they very obviously aren't. I don't think that's the right approach for us, at least here, but there's a lot you can do in saying, this is what good looks like. This is why it's in the interests of your shareholders, of your long-term commercial viability of your company, and of course, in the interests of the planet.
Also jump in here to also add that litigation is often the public face of the law, and I blame US television for this. I absolutely abhor the experience when we do admissions interviews and every third student says, I want to be a lawyer because I watch Suits. And I was like, oh, honey, this is going to be a long one. it's not. You know, it's like we do as lawyers, we always feel, I think I would say, the one thing I always tell my students is going to court is the last thing you want to do. It's very fun if you think you want to spend your time always in dispute, but dispute resolution is, if litigation is dispute resolution, there are also many other ways of resolving disputes. I saw a hand here. Yes, that's right. That's right. Jensen here is from CIL, Center of International Law.
Professor Kalamika.
No, hi. Thank you very much, Jolene. Thank you both, Prof. Koh and Laura, for your remarks. I just wanted to follow up on something you were saying, Laura. I get the sense from your remarks, looking on the one hand at domestic litigations in some jurisdictions as a way of influencing corporate behavior, and in other jurisdictions, almost standard setting or benchmarking best practices. But I'm not hearing anything about international instruments that deal directly with corporate obligations. Things like creating due diligence obligations for corporations with respect to their supply chains and so forth. I wonder if that's because you don't think that that's a very likely avenue to happen, or perhaps you can just expand.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a really good question, and actually, the area that we're most engaged on this is at the EU level, because I think the EU has a real, by virtue of the size of its trade pulling power, it is essentially a regulatory superpower, right? So rules that are made within the EU can have a virtuous impact across the world. And so we're very focused now on the very snuzzily named EU corporate sustainability due diligence regulation that is in negotiation. So that's looking at exactly that. What is it that companies have to do, looking across their entire supply chains, to make sure that they are not in any way complicit in either environmental impacts, deforestation, or human rights impact. I think that's incredibly important. The recently agreed EU deforestation legislation that we worked very hard on, including with indigenous groups and local peoples, is really about saying that anything you sell in the EU, you have to be confident that it's not in any way complicit in deforestation in its supply chain. So I do think that that's an incredibly important tool for corporates to have to think about that accountability and account, across the board, because ultimately what we're doing, what we need to do at a more philosophical level, is reconceptualize value, right? So you're not just looking at what's the cheapest thing on the shelf, what is the best return on investment for our shareholders. We're having to think, we need to think about value in its true sense. What is the impact on the environment? What is the impact in terms of long-term sustainability? And so thinking about all those things in terms of corporate responsibility is critical.
Could I say something? I'm a friend and a champion of the European Union, which doesn't enjoy a good press in this part of the world. But I have a concern about the EU. The European Union sees itself as a normative power, and it feels that the European Union, which has tremendous economic power, can enact rules which they want to make global. And so some recent decision by the EU to protect the environment may inadvertently become protectionist. So the developing countries feel that if the European Union wants to promote a new rule or new norm, it should do it through a multilateral channel, through WTO or through the UN. It is not right for the EU to unilaterally set a norm and apply it to everybody in the world, because the rest of the world had no say in the making of the new norm. And it is not your intention to be protectionist, but the net effect is that it could be protectionist against development.
I absolutely see that, and I think that's a real challenge. I think the counter challenge is quite how hard it is to do things multilaterally, isn't it? And so perhaps sometimes the pragmatic approach is to see what you can make work in a smaller grouping and then try and socialize that and make it work multilaterally. But I absolutely get that challenge, and often it's about how you know, the implementation, getting the implementation right, that is really important.
So as Laura mentioned, I represent ClientEarth in China and started our program there. And there's often, very often, people who ask me questions about this supply chain issue, because a lot of the products that are associated with deforestation around the world, China is almost always the largest consumer by a large margin. And so you'll be pleased to hear that over the last 6-7 years or so, engagement with the Chinese government, which I've also contributed to, is actually starting to bear fruit. I think there's critical mass within the Chinese government now that does see this as a problem, does understand that China plays, as a buying country, a role in this. I would say the Ministry of Environment gets it better than some others, but they have a very strong ear of the top leadership. And I predict that in the next months or maybe year, we will see more signals from the top leadership that encourage Chinese companies to be much more proactive in greening their supply chains. They may take some reference to the EU approach, but they're much more likely to focus on legal. So what is the legal bottom line? Are you operating in a way that is legal within China, but also are you operating in a way which is legal in the countries that you buy from? And are you ensuring that your suppliers are actually operating in a way that is legal in the country where you buy from? So it's very focused on the legal side of it, perhaps coupled with some advice on best practices. This is something that ClientEarth is one of the very few NGOs that is absolutely at the forefront in China on advancing this. Thank you.
Dimitri, I really congratulate you on the good work you're doing in China. And I think it's a paradigm that could be applied to other countries in Asia.
Mr. Koh, you may be happy to hear that I've just been promoted to lead ClientEarth's work in the whole region. And so that's no coincidence. It's because I think our leadership has long understood that our more collaborative approaches in China are actually perhaps also useful as reference in the region, perhaps more so than the more litigious, let's say, approaches in Europe. But I also want to underscore what our CEO has been saying for some time. We work in Europe and the United States on litigation, but that is only maybe a third of what we do. And 2/3 of what we do is also collaborative. It's just that it doesn't hit the news so much.
This conversation could go on and on because there's so many interesting topics and two very interesting speakers. But I also know that Prof. Koh very much appreciates punctuality. So it is on me to end on this note and thank all of you for attending this dialogue today. Thank you.
Thank you.
On behalf of APCEL, I would like to thank the speakers for their fascinating insights, and I think we all feel very hopeful. We have a small token of appreciation we would like to present to you. Yes, it is a coin, a heritage coin for Botanic Gardens. So if we could please give another round of applause to our speakers. Yes, and we would also like to thank the team at ClientEarth who have been instrumental in making this event happen, and in particular acknowledge the efforts of Sean Sung, Peter Barnett, Elizabeth Wu, and Damon Yong. We would also like to thank our team at APCEL, Alicia and Joel, our events team, who have done a phenomenal job, as well as our APCEL researchers, Shoyon and Celine, who have also been working tirelessly to make this event a success. Last but not least, Jolene and I would like to again reiterate our thanks to all the participants for being here today, and again for taking time out of your schedule, and for your unwavering support for APCEL, which we hope will continue for many years to come. And there is lunch served. So please do help yourself a lunch and continue the discussion. Thank you.